Sogomon Tehlirian is the universal hero for the Armenian people.
Do you agree with what Ralph said?
I have to put on my historian's hat whenever I answer that question.
In this episode, we answer the question, who was Soghomon Tehlirian? Then, meet some of my Hollywood friends. Also, the entire history of the genocide in 15 minutes, plus an appearance by AOC. It's all right now on Hollywood and History.
I mean, you're an Emmy winner. I don't have an Emmy.
Hi, Armin.
Hey, Michael, how are you?
Good, and hello, everyone else. Welcome to Hollywood and History. Now, I'm going to launch straight into this. This is technically episode 2, but really this is kind of a restart. If you want, you can go back and look at the other episode that we recorded that, I have a full beard, a little different, but took some time off. This is a weekly podcast. Maybe I shouldn't make that commitment. I said that last time, and here I am a month and a half later. It's not a weekly, but I think I got my act together. Armin's been waiting. He's had his act together, but here we go. For you, everybody watching this, I wanted to start this off with what this podcast is really about, Sogomon Tehlirian. And more than that, there's a lot to that. But before I ask Armin, the historian, to explain who Soghomon Tehlirian was and why he's important, later on in this episode, there's a few things coming up. So this is called a tease for a few things coming up toward the end of this episode. I'm going to be introducing some characters that you will meet as we continue this weekly podcast. Again, I say weekly with a kind of a wink occasionally. Maybe we'll skip a week. Something may come up, but the intent is now to do this weekly. But at the end of this episode, you'll meet a few characters, some Hollywood types, and some other important characters in this adventure that Armin and I have been on for the last, coming up on 3 years now. Also, there's a bit of a countdown that I want to do. Each week, there's going to be a countdown to something. Actually, there's going to be two separate countdowns to two separate significant events. So that's a tease. You'll have to stay tuned and find out what the heck I'm talking about. All right, Armin. Who is Soghomon Tehlirian?
Who's Soghomon Tehlirian? Maybe I should answer that question in a more indirect way, in a more general way. There are many moments in history where the actions of singular individuals have gone on to alter its course in profound and often unpredictable ways. And it's rather sobering to think, for example, how the two bullets fired from the gun of Gavrilo Princip unleashed not only a continent-wide war in 1914, but arguably helped shape world political and social events over the next 30 years. And I'm sure we can think of many other like individuals. And perhaps Soghomon Tehlirian's name would not be one of those that would immediately come to mind to those of us living here in the United States and Europe, but there are so many elements from this man's life that I think lend him a certain universal quality that others may relate to, while certainly not diminishing the reasons that led him to achieve fame or notoriety, depending on how you look at it. Tehlirian was born in a small village in the Ottoman Empire and was just a few years younger than Princip. He was only 18 years old when the First World War broke out, when he volunteered to serve in the Russian army. When the Russians and his unit advanced into Ottoman territory during the second year of the war, they came upon his home village and, in fact, many dozens of towns and villages that had been systematically emptied out of their local Armenian populations by the Ottoman government in what was a concerted, state-organized effort to exterminate the empire's Armenian community. And this young 19-year-old bore personal witness to the destruction of his people, his homeland, and ultimately members of his own family. Personal tragedy and thoughts of revenge consumed Tehlirian to the point that he vowed to hunt down and personally execute the individuals responsible for organizing the first modern genocide of the 20th century. And after roughly 5-6 long years in broad daylight, one spring day in Berlin in March 1921, Tehlirian tracked down and shot the former Ottoman Grand Vizier Talat Pasha, the chief architect of the genocide and who had been living in Germany for about 3 years under the protection of the German government. So when Tehlirian was put on trial for murder, he admitted that he had shot a man, but he said that he was not guilty. And to everyone's astonishment, he was acquitted. And in a way, Tehlirian's life story encapsulates the era he came of age, the great political and social upheaval brought about by a world war, the 1917 October Revolution in Russia, an increasingly connected world of transatlantic maritime travel and communication, civil strife in Weimar Germany, which would then lead to ultimately the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, new understandings of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder in the post-war period, and new notions on international justice and universal questions of right and wrong. And the very fact that the word genocide was coined 20 years later, based partly on what had happened to the Armenians and how Tehlirian's trial had unfolded, suggests to me that we should perhaps acquaint ourselves with his story just a little bit better. That's it in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. All right. So those of you watching this, I encourage you to rewind and listen to what Armin said again, because I asked him ahead of time. I asked him ahead of time to encapsulate why Sogomon Tehlirian is significant. And as I listened back, he, as the good historian and PhD, student he is, he nailed it. But it's a lot to put in. I said, try and keep it under a minute. I don't know, a minute and a half. And so
That was what, 2 minutes?
maybe 2 minutes, but I want, the point was to get as much into a short chunk as possible. And so seriously, listen back again, because Armin wasn't just, that was well thought out and prepared as to why this person, this historical character, is actually significant. I like how he started saying, well, a lot of people don't know the name Gavrilo Princip, but people do know Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and that's what launched World War I, basically, and that's what you started with. And that's how actually the Soghomon Tehlirian story starts as well. He was about 100 miles away from that event. His country was the first country to be attacked in World War I. I mean, the country, not his country, but the country he was in at the time, Serbia. I mean, World War I started where he was, and then he goes on to do a similar action. A young college student assassinates a world leader. That's like the beginning of the story and the end of his story. Except there's a contrast. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just say, I got to take a little break here, do a little commercial. But before I do that, spoiler alert for those of you watching. Soghomon Tehlirian wrote his own story. In fact, I have a copy of it right here. I don't speak Armenian. I don't read Armenian, but this is his personal account in Armenian. It's being translated into English. It's well on its way. It's almost done. It'll be available for anybody who wants to read it in English. It'll be available by next year. I'm pretty sure we'll have it all locked up and published, hopefully. So, spoiler alert, that's what's coming. But if you do want to read something about him, this is another. I got a glare on this. This is the trial, the court transcript. This is an English translation from the Armenian translation from the German translation of the Berlin court trial. Riveting stuff. Courtroom drama that's true. It's in here too, but this is already in English. So if you could find a copy of this is where I started. That's not my commercial, but my commercial is click subscribe right here. If you're watching this, if you're not a subscriber already and you want to follow along as Armin and I tell this story, it's the story of he and I uncovering the story of Sogomon Tehlirian. Even though he's known it most of his life, I first came to it almost 3 years ago, and we've been on this crazy roller coaster ride ever since. So subscribe to the channel and pass it on. This is the only way, this is the best way actually to get this story out to the English speaking world. is here on a YouTube channel. It's a new world. This news can travel as fast and as far as you, the viewer. We can share it, and we can record it and produce it and share it, but it takes the audience or those interested or those who recognize the importance of this story. It takes all of us together to spread the word. So there, end of commercial. Well, there's another little commercial. I have a GoFundMe campaign that's linked in the description to help me continue this podcast. There, end of commercial. Now, there's another little spoiler. Not only is this story going to be published, but I have a partner, a business partner, and we've secured the rights to it. The rights to the Soghomon Tehlirian story for his own memoir from his point of view. This guy who sought out the architect of the Armenian genocide. I mean, his whole family was wiped out. Everyone that was in the Ottoman Empire that he was related to was gone forever, except for one. He found one of a niece. So there is a little bit of a happy parts of his story. But there was no justice for the Armenians. There was no justice for the Turkish, the Ottoman Armenians. And he brought some justice. And that's his story. And I have the rights to it. I've already written the screenplay. There are other people trying to tell this story or telling versions of this story. But without his memoir, you don't really know who this guy was. The court transcript will tell you what happened at the end of this story. But this memoir is the whole story, and the script is done. There's a few producers looking at it right now. So that's spoiler alert for down the road. But we're going to rewind and start all the way back to where this whole story began. That expression, that phrase, some of you, this actually may be the first time you've ever heard the words Armenian genocide. Unless you're Armenian, unless you're a historian, it's frighteningly too likely that that's true, that you've never heard the words Armenian genocide. And I honestly, I can't remember learning anything about it in school. And I went to school in 3 different states around the United States. And the first time I remember really hearing it was, about 5 years ago in 2015, which was the 100-year anniversary. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Armin. For those watching this, I mean, literally, I probably, maybe I said, yeah, I've heard of the Armenian genocide when somebody said it to me, but I wouldn't have been able to say when it happened, why it happened, where it happened. I wouldn't have known it was World War I probably. So Armin, why don't you, I'll give you a little time to go off, but tell us, the viewer, about the Armenian genocide. I know that's quite a question to ask a historian. You can go on for hours and hours and hours, but you try and do it in a few minutes to hit on the important points to educate your first time learner of the Armenian genocide.
Okay, you really do enjoy putting me on the spot, don't you?
Well, I can start and you can cut me off, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, do you want the 10-second version of the story or the 1-hour version of the story? I mean, I'm just kidding, of course.
I know. 5 minute. I'll let you go as long as you want.
A brief history of the Armenian genocide. Okay, so I suppose the one departure point for the story is the Ottoman Empire itself. So the Ottoman Empire began really as a principality at the end of the 13th century in what's now northeastern Turkey, what's the northeastern part of the Republic of Turkey. And over the next century and a half, it began to expand and gain larger territory at the expense of its neighbors, including other Turkic tribes. The Ottomans began as just one particular tribe and in this region. And in 1453, of course, the Ottomans capture Constantinople, the last holdout of the Byzantine Empire. And in the next century or two, the the Ottomans expand even further. And in this process, they incorporate and integrate into its fold peoples of many different ethnic groups and cultures, Greek-speaking Orthodox peoples, the Bulgarians, people who will, over the next few centuries, develop national consciousness, but at that time still were in the process of, the national identity had not really come fully about. But Greeks, Armenians, Jews formed the largest non-Muslim groups in the Ottoman Empire during this time. But in the process, the Ottomans also expand into the lands that now form the modern states of the Middle East, including what's now Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and also parts of what are now Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Oman. And even, they expand even further into the Balkans, and to North Africa. And so really the Ottoman Empire was one of the most formidable imperial states from about the 15th century until really about the 18th century, when in the face of a more confident Europe, it started hemorrhaging territory to its neighbors. And in the late 18th century, the Russian Empire really comes into its own as well, and wages several wars against the Ottomans, especially during the course of the 19th century, where I believe in just one, with the exception of one engagement, the Russians always emerge on top. So it comes to the point where by the end of the late 19th century, the Ottomans, who have been under the reign of sultans, their monarchs, are really on the one may argue were on the retreat. And in the face of this growing level of European aggression and by the early 20th century, there were enough people in the Ottoman Empire who were sufficiently alarmed by the empire's seeming decline, and these are words which historians should use a little bit, and do use with a little bit of caution when we use words, for example, decline. But if we, there was one group of army officers and civil servants who were alarmed enough to form their own conspiratorial group against the reigning Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, and in 1908, launch a coup and he's not immediately unseated from power, but they forced him to restore a constitution that had only been in place for about 2 years and had been in use for really, had been in place just 30 years earlier. So the constitution is widely heralded by the peoples in the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians especially, who over the course of centuries had developed a sort of symbiotic relationship with the empire, even though they were living in a hierarchical society where their religion was not considered actually to be the true religion, as Islam was held that preeminent position in Ottoman society for the course of about 6 centuries. But now, and especially during the 19th century, there were increasing moves by Ottoman leaders to bring the non-Muslims into the fold of governance. And for Armenians, there were a number of setbacks and frustrations where they felt they were unable to obtain the rights that they felt were due to them. And it really depended on where you looked at it in the Ottoman Empire. In the eastern provinces, where conditions were much more precarious, you had very contentious relations between Armenian peasants and, say, for example, Kurdish nomads and tribesmen. But by 1908, with the restoration of the constitution, there was this belief that the Armenians and the Greeks and the Jews and Turks and Arabs and every other ethnic group that this empire comprised could claim the rights that they were due, and do so in a way where they lived in harmony with their neighbors and under the banner of Ottomanism. And Ottomanism was an ideological framework which saw all the peoples as citizens of this one empire, regardless of what religion they belonged to or what language they spoke. But unfortunately, in the next few years, the Ottomans were unable to, at the very least, weren't really able to catch a break. So even though there were Ottoman Armenian members of parliament that were elected into power, and there were Armenians who also obtained positions in the Ottoman cabinet, the Ottoman Empire itself did not seem to be able to catch a break when it came to these wars that broke out just a few years later. So in 1911, Italy invades the Ottoman province of Tripolitania, which is now the modern day Libya. In 1912, 1913, you have the Balkan states launch a surprise attack against the Ottomans in what are its remaining territories in the Balkan regions. And as if that were not enough, in June 1914, there is this assassination of the Archduke, which just a month later leads to the outbreak of the First World War. And by this time, the Ottoman Empire was under the control of several leaders of what's now, what was of a political faction known as the Committee of Union and Progress. And as we spoke a little bit earlier, Talat Pasha was one of the most eminent leaders of the CUP, as it's referred to. And at the time, he was the interior minister, and a few years later during the war, he occupies the position of the Grand Vizier, which would perhaps be the equivalent of a prime minister or the head of the Ottoman cabinet. And the Ottomans enter on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians during the war, the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers at least. And in the end of 1914, they, along with the Germans, launch a surprise attack against the Russian military and civilian installations along the Black Sea, and there begins opens up a new front in the First World War, where the Russians field a massive army and prepare to invade and occupy parts of Ottoman territory. And the provinces where this war was waged, in what's Eastern Anatolia, at least is referred to, and Western Armenia is it's also referred to, but were regions where the greater part of the Armenian population resided. And about 1914, it's quite possible that anywhere from about 1.2 to perhaps 2 million Armenians lived in the empire, but again, the majority of them were concentrated in this region. And so you have these two massive armies which wage total war against one another. And in almost every engagement, the Ottomans are bested by the Russian army. And in the face of several defeats, including a very large one by the Ottomans in December 1914, January 1915 at Sarıkamış, the Ottoman army suffers catastrophic losses. So several months pass by, and historians believe this was at the time when the decision was made by leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, foremost by Talat, to systematically uproot the Armenian population, because the reason they gave was that they suspected the Armenians were natural sympathizers with the Russians, and they would be removed from the war zone. Whereas, in fact, Armenian communities all throughout the empire, even those far away from the battlefront, were also uprooted, and that included the most insignificant of hamlets and villages, which posed no danger at all, and yet they were still targeted all the same. And so you had the Ottoman civilian and military authorities oversee the deportations that ensued. And at first, the men, those Armenian men who were already serving in the Ottoman military, had already been disarmed and placed in labor battalions. And so, in the words of one historian, they were like sitting ducks, and they were one of the first to be eliminated. And perhaps that may make a little bit more sense because, of course, the young men are viewed as the source of manpower for any fighting force. And so that just left the women, children, and the elderly and the infirm in the towns and provinces in the interior on the home front. And they were given just a few days to prepare their belongings and to begin on a march into the desert in what's now modern-day Syria, which is known as Deir al-Zor. And these deportee caravans were subject to attacks by Ottoman gendarmes, by Kurdish nomads, by anyone who saw the opportunity to plunder and essentially do whatever they would like, because this is where the state, in one sense, really failed its citizens because it looked the other way, whereas it could look toward the benefit and the welfare, of its non-Armenian citizens. But when it came to the Armenians themselves, the state did not actually take any measure to protect them. Indeed, it was the one that was fostering this kind of climate and was encouraging these kinds of attacks, and doing so in a way which would give it a sense of plausible deniability, where once other powers began noticing, once there were Americans and Germans, missionaries, for example, and observers who noticed these kinds of measures taking place, the government and the state would be able to claim that it had no hand in it. In fact, it was trying to do its best to protect the Armenians. But again, the pattern was so obvious that you could see how all the towns and villages that were depopulated in the course of 1915 followed the same pattern, and that suggests a level of intentionality and foreplanning which the Ottomans had put into place. And these kinds of massacres and subjection to the elements, once these deportees arrived in places like in Syria, where the temperature in the summer of 1915 would reach 110, 120 degrees. And so you can imagine how civilians who've been deprived of any sustenance and ability to wear and to clothe themselves and protect themselves from the weather would succumb very easily to disease and starvation and other forms of illnesses and illnesses. And so this would go on for the next 3 years, and it would be not until October 1918, once the Ottomans signed an armistice with the Allies, because they began to suffer military reversals over the course of the previous year. But I think that's the best I can do under the circumstances. I think
No, that's good.
10 minutes
Again,
maybe.
that's somewhere between a 10-second and a 1-hour version, right? It's difficult to tell such a big story in Hollywood on screen. It's really difficult to capture all of those nuances and the important points and who's the villain and who's the hero. And mind you, the Turks are not the villains, the Armenians are not the heroes. It's the bad guys that are the villains, and it's the good guys that are heroes. There are good Turks and evil Turks, and there are good Armenians and evil Armenians, and that's borne out in this whole story. And so, but how do you tell this whole story? You do need a hero to follow. And when I first came to this huge Armenian genocide event, how do you encapsulate all of that and draw an audience in a 2 or 3 hour movie? Oh my gosh, I couldn't believe the story of Sogomon Tehlirian had never been told in the English speaking world. It's never, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, and I'm sure even on this podcast, as I heard his story, he's like the Forrest Gump of the Armenian genocide. He's at every significant event. He's there. I won't go through the details, but it's like you learn by you following this one guy's story, you learn everything that happened from the beginning of the war to his trial. And our friend Ralph Winter, Armin, I interviewed him.
So Sogomon Tehlirian is the universal hero in the Armenian community for taking down the architect of, the genocide and attempting to right the wrong in a very specific way that has, Armenians cheering for someone who takes on and risks his life to go do that. So this is a pretty compelling story about him and about, what he confronts and what he has to go through.
Do you agree with him? Do you agree with what Ralph said?
Okay, so I have to put on my historian's hat whenever I answer that question. One could definitely argue, and I know you're gonna laugh whenever I frame my response in this way. One can definitely argue that Tehlirian occupies a revered, almost sacred position among Armenians today for what he did. So if you go to the Republic of Armenia today, you will see, for example, schools named after him, or his image perhaps is brandished about on videos on YouTube, and even his gravesite in Fresno, California, also looks almost like a pantheon of sorts, where there's it's like entering a Roman villa and seeing these tree-lined pathway which leads to this monument, really, rather than just a simple gravesite where you have an eagle perched on top of the monument, and it's has a snake in its mouth. And of course the imagery is very vivid, and this is, I believe, something that was designed and constructed in the 1960s. That is after, maybe just a few years or right after his death. So you can clearly gain a good idea of this hollowed position that he occupies for Armenians, for what he did and what he represents.
That's what I get for asking a historian a yes or no question. But I expected it. Like, as I've researched this, he's a polarizing figure. I mean, I think the vast majority of Armenians that know his story will hail him as a hero, but there's certainly controversy. He walked up to a guy and shot him in cold blood in the street. Okay, do you want to encourage that kind of behavior? I mean, if you idolize a person that did that, then maybe you're encouraging that kind of behavior. So it's controversial. Taking matters into your own hands. You don't want people to take the law into their own hands. But I think there's evidence enough that this is this is not something to be emulated, but it's something that stands out as an exception in history. But again, we'll get into all that. Now, I want to wrap this up here. So that I teased a couple things at the beginning. Now, what is this countdown I'm referring to? We're counting down in 35 weeks. That's 35. Put the numbers 35 up on the screen. 35 weeks from this week is the 100-year anniversary of the assassination of Talat Pasha by Soghomon Tehlirian. And the other countdown is in 46 weeks from this week is the 100-year anniversary of Sogomon Tehlirian's court trial, his verdict. All right. Those are the countdowns. Now, I want to introduce a few characters that you're going to see more of in this podcast. One of them is Ralph Winter. You've already seen a clip of Ralph. Here's another clip of Ralph.
I think what makes this stand out is that it's a true story, that it's got authentic, evidence that it's based on. And I think that's what makes, crafted into a story, makes for a good movie. A compelling hero, a journey that, you want to go down the road with this hero every step of the way. What are they going to decide? What are the things they confront? That's the elements that this has, and now it's about crafting that into something that you can't take your eyes off of.
There's a great story about how I got connected with Ralph, and that'll be coming up. I I think a little bit about it in the previous episode. We'll talk about more of it in the coming episodes. But then there's a few other characters. Before I even came to the Armenian Genocide, I had started writing scripts on my own. And I mean, I worked in Hollywood in post-production as a producer as well, and won a trophy and stuff. But I've been teaching myself how to write screenplays and got myself a mentor. I got connected with this guy.
Among Michael's many skills are that he's an editor, and in my opinion, an editor is one of the most important people in the film. That they are doing the last rewrite of the film. It teaches you structure, it teaches you how to get the most out of the emotion in scenes, and that's a real asset for Michael to have that skill. And by the way, he's won an Emmy.
His name is Dave McFadzean. He's the creator of Home Improvement, Roseanne. He's done some movies like What Women Want with Mel Gibson. This guy's a successful guy in Hollywood, not just a producer and a writer, but the creator of some of these TV shows. So I got a script into his hands a couple years ago. He said, "You got what it takes." And then before I launched off on my own, seeking my own project, he read something that I wrote, and he said, I believe in you. I want you to succeed. I'm behind you. So we'll hear a few more bites from Dave. But the first person I contacted when I learned about the Armenian Genocide, when I here I am, I don't know anything about it. Oh, I know, I have an Armenian friend. It's Marina.
I was sitting in an edit bay and got a text from Michael with literally the question, what do you know about the Armenian Genocide? And when you ask an Armenian, what do you know about the Armenian Genocide, our immediate response is to tell you anything and everything and explain to you why you should know about this and the significance of it. And we all have a personal story and attachment to this event. So my immediate reaction was, what do you need to know? When can you talk?
And Armin, you've met Marina, right?
Yes, I think it's at the CBS studios.
Yeah, so Marina and I worked together, and like the day after somebody told me about the Armenian Genocide, I met up with her, and she opened up Wikipedia, and the fire hose turned on, and I launched off on this adventure. So she's a very important character, and there's several others that you'll get to meet as we go along. One of the things, like here's two very polarized characters. Here's good friend of mine named Brian Godawa.
We talked through the story structure, and I thought, wow, you have a great Hollywood movie that will be both an entertaining story, but also an important one about the Armenian Genocide. But then I said, but there's one thing you definitely need to have, and I remember asking him, did he have any romantic interest? And he goes, well, let me tell you that. And he proceeded to tell me about his journey, Sogomon's romantic story with Anahid. And I said, okay, now you not only have an important story, but you have a Hollywood blockbuster on your hands.
He's a screenwriter, but he's also a theologian. And he's an important person in my life because, it's in particular with the Armenian Genocide, Armenians are a Christian nation that were subjugated in a Muslim nation, and so Brian is a really good sounding board for what the theological implications of Sogomon's actions, etc. But he's also tends to lean politically in our culture, very politically to the right. Did I point in the right direction? To the right. But then here's another very, very good friend of mine. Her name is Shannon Thomas.
Witnessing one of the worst genocides in human history, the first megadeath in recorded human history that happened in World War I before, the Holocaust and everything went down with Hitler and the genocide conventions. That was all World War II, and yet we completely somehow left out what happened to the Armenian people.
She's worked in international conflict resolution, and she's fully on board in this project as well. And she's even been in a documentary that featured Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Here's a clip of us at the premiere at Sundance.
Early on in the film, you see us in a conference.
What are we doing, Shannon? Tell me.
Well, we just saw the premiere of Knock Down the House, including the now #famous AOC, but there's a bunch of wonderful candidates and their supporting teams here from Justice Democrats, Brand New Congress.
So here are two people. The thing I'm grateful about working on this project, Armenian Genocide Project, is that there is something that no matter what end of a political spectrum or any spectrum, anything people disagree upon, it's pretty universal that we all agree that genocide is evil and that we should expose evil. And so these are characters that you'll meet along the way. I've got sound bites from them whenever it's appropriate. So I'm going to sign off. Armin, you have any final words before I sign off? Before we sign off?
Not really. I just am waiting until you can let me go back to my books. The entire shelf I have to read by the end of the night.
True to character. He's bored with anything else. Let me dive into history some more. All right. Well, again, share this video, subscribe. Even you can click that little notification bell. If you click that bell a couple times, you'll get notifications whenever I put up videos. If you haven't looked around on this channel, Tales of Truth, there's a bunch of videos of like kind of hints of stuff that's coming up. Armin and I have traveled around the world. We've taken a cameraman with us, and there's a lot coming. So on that note, there's a little more detail about Sogomon on the GoFundMe page. So if you want to read some details. All right, signing off. Thank you. Stay tuned. Next week we will be back. We'll pick up kind of where we left off. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The truth is often not very interesting.
You're absolutely right.
Except in this story.
All right, you want to sit down?
Yeah, sure.
Where do you want me?
Hey, can I pass this on to you guys? It's already rolling. This is a.
Do you want to just keep shooting?
Just shoot a little behind the scenes. So be careful because if you, this will spin around. Okay, see, it's a camera.